Hi, my name is Katie Marrotte, and this is Mushroom Hunting in the Bubble. This is a presentation that I put together on inference-based CBT based on an article that I wrote a couple years ago about what it's like to be a person with lived experience who is also a mushroom hunter who has obsessions about accidentally harming people. So this is ICBT from a clinical lens and also from a lived experience lens. So in case you don't know who the heck I am, my name is Katie Marrotte. I am a licensed clinical social worker out in Connecticut. I'm also a forager. I am a falconer. I am a mycophile. I am somebody who absolutely loves mushrooms and mushroom hunting. And I am also an OCD therapist. I am a lot of things to a lot of people. I'm a daughter. I am a wife to my beloved husband. I am a therapist. I'm a friend. I am an ICBT trainer. I am a social worker. I have many different roles that I encapsulate throughout my life. I'm also a nature enthusiast. I am an apprentice class falconer in the state of Connecticut, hoping to test for my general falconry license this year. I'm also a Connecticut master gardener. I say I'm all, I've graduated the program with all of my, with all but dissertation. I did not complete my final project yet, so technically I'm not a master gardener, but hey, I've got all the information that I need. I'm also an amateur mycologist and mushroom hunter. I am super enthusiastic about mushroom hunting in particular, but I also forage wild plants and berries and fruits and all kinds of other stuff. So I kind of do it all. It's just that mushroom hunting happens to be my personal favorite. I'm also a hobby farmer. So I live on a hobby farm with my husband, and we have a permaculture food forest on our property. We have chickens, we have bees, we have rabbits, we raise quail, we do all kinds of super fun stuff. And on top of all of those wonderful and exciting things, I also happen to have obsessive compulsive disorder. I've had an OCD since I was a kid. I do not have a before and after onset. It just kind of is, it's just an intrinsic part of my reasoning process. And because I have OCD, that means my brain reasons in two different ways. I have normal reasoning, just like everybody with OCD has. Just like all of your clients, even with the most severe OCD, they still use their normal reasoning when when their OCD is not triggered. And that reasoning is characterized by relying on possibility appropriately. Possibility is around us all the time, and it is a normal ingredient in our normal non-OCD reasoning. We also have trust in the senses in the self. So we're trusting what our senses tell us. We're trusting, let's say, our intentions, our desires, our emotions. And we also use what we call relevant associations, which is information that is in context, stuff that we've heard from other people, things that we've read articles about, just our normal common sense stuff that we collect over a long period of time. When I'm using these three ingredients, I come to a reality-based conclusion with direct evidence from my senses. In contrast, I can also use obsessional reasoning when I encounter an OCD trigger. And obsessional reasoning is reasoning that's characterized by relying too much on possibility. Again, possibility is around us all the time, but if we're using obsessional reasoning, then we're going to be relying way, way, way too much on possibility. Rather than trusting our senses or trusting ourselves, we are going to distrust both of those things. So we're not going to trust what our senses are telling us. Even if our senses are telling us that everything is okay and everything is safe, we're going to take that information and we're going to disregard that. We're also going to be using something called irrelevant associations, things that we've heard from other people, stuff that we have read online, things that we've seen on Reddit, TikToks, other people's experience, things that have happened to us in the past. And we're going to be using those things out of context because there is no direct evidence in the here and now when somebody is using obsessional reasoning that there is actually a problem. And so this is going to lead to a confusion between reality and possibility. And by possibility, we can also say imagination. So we're confusing imagination for reality. And there's a reasoning process that happens. Now, before I even go out on my mushroom hunt, I know that I am prone to using obsessional reasoning. I'm really prone to treating imagined hypotheticals with the same vigilance and the same absorption as a real life scenario that actually is happening. So because of this reasoning process, I'm going to be confusing something called a feared possible self, which we will get to a little bit later, with my real self. I'm afraid that I'm somebody who could be clueless. And I'm going mushroom hunting as my feared possible self. I'm going mushroom hunting as being afraid that I could be a clueless person. Now, I've built narratives about being clueless using all kinds of irrelevant associations, stories from other people, documentaries I've watched, disasters I've heard of, personal experiences where maybe I wasn't paying enough attention, or maybe something bad has happened to me in the past. Collected lots of information about that topic to create a really convincing story that I could actually be a clueless person. And now that I'm going mushroom hunting, I'm approaching a sensitive scenario where there is a possibility of accidental harm that I could be responsible for. And so these individual obsessional doubts are going to start popping up. That's why we call the feared possible self the algorithm of the OCD, because the feared possible self is going to determine what individual doubts that myself and somebody else with OCD is going to experience. So let's go mushroom hunting in the OCD bubble. I've got my kit. I've got my very fancy little mushroom hunting knife. On one side, it has a curved blade so that I can remove the fruiting bodies from the earth. And on the other side, it's got a fancy little hard bristle brush so that I can brush off debris and worms and anything else that's on there that I don't necessarily want to eat. I also have a mushroom hunting guide. I don't necessarily take this with me every time or really that much anymore because I've been doing this for almost a decade and I'm pretty well versed on what to eat and what not to eat. And I'm also going to be bringing with me my obsessional reasoning, where I have a tendency to confuse a hypothetical possibility for a real probability in the here and now. Now, anybody who drives with me knows that I'm constantly looking for three things: mushrooms, forageable plants, and hunting grounds. So when I see this site right here, this beautiful cluster of pearl-colored fungi, I shout for my husband to stop the car. Now, because I'm an experienced mushroom hunter, I can tell from 30 feet away in a moving car exactly what kind of mushroom this is. So the mushroom that's pictured is an oyster mushroom, probably a spring oyster, because this was taken in, I think, April or May of that year. And these are some of the things that I look for when identifying a mushroom. We look for the growing medium. Is it growing out of dirt or is it growing on a tree? We look for host species. If it's growing on a tree, what kind of tree is it? I'm going to look for the arrangement. I'm going to look for, how is this growing? Is this a shelf mushroom? Are they gregarious? Are they growing in a group? Is this solitary? I'm going to be thinking about seasonality, because we know that there are certain mushrooms that are only going to be available during certain types of year. For example, a very delicious choice edible called maitake or hen of the wood is only going to be available in my area from September to October. I want to be looking for the defining features. What color is it? What does it smell like? What is it growing near? All kinds of different identifying features. And I want to know about the lookalikes in the area. So what I know about this mushroom, this oyster mushroom, is it's growing on the correct medium. This is a saprotrophic or wood-eating mushroom. It's growing on a known host species of tree. It is the correct season for spring oyster mushrooms. It has all of the defining features of oyster mushrooms. It's got a distinct smell. Some say licorice or anise, but I think it smells a little bit fishy. The arrangement, this closely stacked cluster of shelf mushrooms, we've got some gills running down the stipe, and how it seems to have almost no stem, that it sprouts directly from it, comes bursting out of the side of a tree. I also know that there's no poisonous lookalikes for this mushroom in my area at this time of year, which means that I have all the information that I need to know, and I need to be certain that this is indeed an oyster mushroom. And then something really interesting happens in my brain. I know what this is, and then I ask a what if question. I go, well, what if I get the identification wrong? right? So when I could have been trusting my senses, I could have been trusting my common sense, I could be certain in what I know. Instead, what I choose to do is disregard that and start thinking about hypotheticals that I might be wrong. And I'm going to start treating that hypothetical as if it's really happening. So now my reality, where I know what this mushroom is, gets left behind. And instead, I turn to a hypothetical where me, as a clueless person, maybe I've accidentally misidentified this mushroom. So here's my obsessional reasoning. Again, we've got over-reliance on possibility. I'm distrusting and dismissing my actual sense evidence, and I'm using irrelevant associations. Notice, too, that there's no direct evidence in the here and now. Actually, I know exactly what this is. And rather than listening to what I know, I'm going to disregard what I know. And instead, I'm going to turn to my imagination. I'm going to turn to the doubt. And the doubt says, I might have misidentified this mushroom. So we have over-reliance on possibility here because, of course, it's possible that I could misidentify a mushroom and accidentally poison my family. That is perfectly within the realm of possibility. By the way, the only thing that makes something possible is our ability to imagine it. So if I can imagine myself accidentally misidentifying this mushroom, it's possible. Of course, that's possible. All obsessions are conceptually, abstractly possible. And we'll get to why that's not relevant here in a little bit. But for now, what's important for us to focus on is, yes, this is possible. Of course, it's possible. I'm also going to be dismissing the actual evidence that's in front of me. I have all the information that I need in order to determine what kind of mushroom this is. And then I think, but you know what? It might actually be something else. I know in that moment exactly what it is. And then instead, I turn to an imagined hypothetical. And some irrelevant associations might come into my mind too, like other people have been poisoned by misidentifying mushrooms, so I could misidentify a mushroom too. So when we're starting with ICBT, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to sequence out our obsessional doubts. We're going to slow down that process for ourselves or for our clients so that we can see what's happening in this person's mind when they encounter a trigger. We know that without an obsessional doubt, somebody is going to stay planted in reality. In ICBT, we understand that the doubt is the first thing that pops up into somebody's awareness to let us know that OCD is on the scene. We also know that that doubt is the result of an obsessional reasoning process. And the way for us to start attacking that process is through that obsessional doubt. So we say that the doubt is the treatment target. So what's really interesting is that no matter what type of OCD somebody has, no matter whether they're concerned about contamination or harm or hit and run, it doesn't necessarily matter what the presentation is. All obsessions are going to follow the exact same sequence. They're actually really predictable. And for a lot of us with OCD, this is going to feel very bewildering and very mystifying. And, we're going to get tricked and we're going to get pulled in. What we want to be doing in Module 1 is slowing down. And we want to be identifying every part of this sequence. So we have the trigger, we have the doubt, which is a what if question. We have the consequence of that doubt. What would happen if that what if question came true? And then we have anxiety, which is kind of like, well, what would this mean about? What would this mean about somebody? If all this came true, then what would happen? What's this big scary end of the story? And then again, the most natural thing for somebody to do when they're lost in this sequence is they're going to do a compulsion. So what's the behavior that somebody feels compelled to do on the basis of this sequence? What do they feel compelled to do to make sure that this doubt and this consequence don't come true, or to get rid of this feeling of anxiety? And here's what mine looks like. We have a trigger. I pick a wild mushroom. I do this all the time. And then we have a doubt. I ask myself a what if question. What if I misidentify this mushroom? And there's the consequence. Okay, so if I misidentify this mushroom, if that's true, then I could poison myself or my family. Reasonable, right? And the anxiety is that, well, if I poison them, they're going to get really sick. They might even die. And by the way, it's going to be all my fault. One of OCD's favorite lies, and it's going to be all your fault. And then I do a compulsion. So I'm going to check again, and I'm going to check again, and I'm going to flip it over, and I'm really going to think about it. And I'm going to consider it from all angles. Am I really sure that this is the mushroom that I think it is? And I'm going to take out my little app and I'm going to scan it, and it's going to tell me it's an oyster mushroom. And I'm going to go, but what if it's not? Right? So for many of us, this probably sounds pretty familiar. So we're doing this for a reason. When we slow down the sequence, we want to help our clients demystify the sequence. And this information that we collect here is going to be built upon in later modules. And arguably the most important piece of the sequence is the obsessional doubt. What is this? What is the what if question that somebody is asking themselves in this situation? But capturing the rest of the sequence is really important. We want to know what set it off, and we want to know everything that comes after, because we really want to slow down and demystify this process for yourself or for your client. Now, next, when we are doing module 2, we're going to take that information that we collected in module 1. Specifically, we're going to take the doubt. And I've only focused on one doubt here, but when you're doing this on your own, or when you're doing this with a therapist, or when a therapist is doing this with a client, we want to be picking the top, let's say the top 5, right? What's the most pressing doubt for somebody? And be taking a look at those. For the purpose of time, I'm going to do just one, and we're going to focus solely on this individual doubt throughout this process. So when we're looking at module 2, there's a lot of really important takeaways. One of them is that through the ICBT lens, our obsessions aren't random. They're actually not random at all. We know that all doubts, whether they are bizarre or strange or seem really, really out there, there's going to be reasoning behind that. There's going to be obsessional reasoning, sure, but there's going to be logic and there's going to be reasoning as to why somebody might believe that their obsession really could be true. Because if any of us really considered these obsessions to be impossible, they wouldn't bother us. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be asking ourselves, or we're asking our clients, why do you believe this what if question really could be true? And what we're doing here is actually really cool. We know that there is this reasoning process that somebody with OCD is going to be relying on when they encounter a trigger that sets off their particular obsession. What we're going to be doing in module 2 is we're actually going to be starting to get an accurate snapshot of that reasoning process. So we're going to be asking, why might somebody believe that their obsession really could be true? And this module sets us up to collect that information really easily. We've got 5 labels that we can 5 buckets, let's say, that we can throw each piece of information in that our clients or you yourself might use to justify why their obsession might be true. And those 5 buckets are facts, rules, hearsay, personal experience, and possibility. And here's what that might look like for me. We know this is an objective fact, right? An abstract but objective fact. Mushrooms have deadly lookalikes and people get poisoned all the time. That's irrefutable. Yep, 100% true. And then there are some rules, and these rules are, passed down from generation to mushroom hunter to generation to mushroom hunter, that you should check with at least 2 credible sources before you eat something. That's a pretty good rule of thumb, right? You should probably know what it is that you're eating. And we have some hearsay here too. This is stuff that I've heard from other people or news articles that I've seen. I read stories often of pets, children, and adults being poisoned by eating unidentified mushrooms. It happens all the time, and I've heard of it. And then we have personal experience, and this one's a little bit embarrassing, but I'll share it with you. A few weeks ago, I misidentified a plant and ate it in front of my friend because I wanted to impress my friend with my foraging knowledge, and I got the type of plant wrong. It's not poisonous, it just doesn't taste very good. So I threw it in my mouth and I chewed it up, and I was like, haha, look at me, I'm so impressive. And it tasted disgusting, and I spit it out in front of him, and everybody had a good laugh at me, which is fine. And of course, possibility. There's always a chance that I could misidentify something. That is completely within the realm of possibility. Again, all obsessions are possible. Now, if you're running through module 2 with yourself or with a client, you don't necessarily have to have each of these 5 buckets filled. There's a lot more reasoning that I could put on here, but for the sake of brevity, and the sake of the space on the slide, I included one sentence for each. There's actually a lot of facts I could include here. There's a lot of rules I could include here. There's a lot of hearsay I could include here. So we want to get a pretty robust snapshot of the reasoning. So maybe somebody has a lot of facts and a lot of rules, but they don't have a lot of personal experience. That's totally okay. Maybe they have a lot of personal experience and a lot of hearsay, but they don't have a lot of rules, and that's totally okay too. Now, just to illustrate why I believe the stakes could be very, very high, we have two mushrooms here that grow in Connecticut. One of these is edible. The other contains deadly amounts of amatoxin that will not only kill you, but it's going to hurt the entire time. And this toxin causes liver and kidney failure, gastrointestinal bleeding, coma, and death. There's no antidote. The only thing that the hospital can do is keep you comfortable. Now, this compound is responsible for 90% of mushroom-related poisonings across the world. But the poison is in the dose. If you eat enough of these, you're toast. Now, luckily, they're not commonly eaten because they don't look particularly tasty, and they also taste pretty bad. But how do we know which one is which? One of these is going to kill you, the other one's a choice edible. So the one on the left is a choice edible. This is called a sheathed wood tuft. And here's its poisonous lookalike. Really fun name. We call it funeral bells. Right? Some nasty mushrooms have some pretty mean and scary names, and for good reason. You're not going to eat something that is called funeral bells. You're just not. So when we're looking at somebody's obsessional reasoning, we're going to be capturing part of the obsessional reasoning process called irrelevant associations, and also a little bit of possibility. So when we're doing module 2, we're going to be taking a look at these two categories right here, irrelevant associations and that over-reliance and possibility piece. We're going to build a lot more on possibility in a later module. But for now, we just want our clients to understand that all obsessions are possible in the abstract. If we really believed that they weren't possible, we wouldn't worry about them. Now, we call these irrelevant associations because without direct evidence, those things are not relevant to the here and now. It's not relevant if other people have misidentified mushrooms or if I have misidentified plants in the past, because in the moment, I know exactly what kind of mushroom this is. So that's why we call this an irrelevant association, because there is no direct evidence in the here and now to make this relevant to the current moment. And this is going to bring us to module 2, where we're going to be looking at the obsessional story. A couple of really important takeaways for this module. We know that obsessional doubts feel real. We also know that stories are how we organize information. And we also know that stories create real feelings. So if you think about the scariest movie you've ever seen or the scariest book you've ever read, I can imagine that even though you know that that's not really happening to you as you're reading or watching this movie, the artistry in a horror movie or in a horror book is that it's going to create fear. We know that stories create real feelings. For instance, I can tell you the story about how I rescued my first dog, and that can create that can create feelings in you of compassion and excitement and, oh my goodness, isn't that so cute? Because stories change the way that we feel. And when we organize our reasoning about an obsessional doubt about a trigger into a story, that story can change the way that we feel about a trigger. OCD stories are rich and imaginative. They're going to flow really smoothly. So notice that I'm starting with an obsessional doubt, and I'm starting with this trigger here, and I'm going to be filling this in with my reasoning and ending that story with a compulsion. Naturally, this is going to raise my anxiety, and I'm going to feel compelled and convinced by this reasoning, because why would I take a chance, right? This story is really credible, and it's going to change the way that I feel. Now, the purpose of capturing a story, taking that reasoning and putting it into a story, is not to create an imaginal script, as you might with exposure and response prevention. The purpose of this story is not to induce anxiety. The purpose of an imaginal script, that is intended to create anxiety, and often that script is going to focus on the consequences rather than the reasoning. Now, if we're coming at this through an ICBT lens, what we want to do is capture the reasoning only. So notice in this story that I am not I'm not writing about, and then I'm going to poison my family and everybody's going to die and I might go to jail for manslaughter and it's going to be the worst thing ever and I would have to live with that guilt forever. Notice I'm not doing that. Instead, I'm taking my reasoning and putting it into a narrative, and we can explore how this narrative makes me feel. This narrative makes me feel pretty distressed. It makes me feel compelled to do something because the story that we tell about something is going to change the way that we feel. So here's my story. I pick a mushroom. I might have misidentified this mushroom. I know that mushrooms can have multiple poisonous lookalikes and species can be very easy to confuse. Misidentification can have deadly consequences. I know that even experts misidentify mushrooms. Mushroom poisonings are very unpleasant and sometimes fatal. Even I have misidentified things while foraging. So it's possible that this just looks like an oyster mushroom. It is actually very poisonous. I should check again to make sure it is the species that I think it is. Naturally, this is going to create in me a sense of unease. Naturally, this is going to, because this feels very credible and this feels very immersive to me, feels very convincing, I'm going to feel as if there is something that I need to do about this. We call that a compulsion. Now, there's another story that I could be telling here. We call this the counter story. And the purpose in doing a counter story is not to create a new ritual. I'm not going to write this on my phone and whip this out next time I feel triggered so that I can rehearse it and make sure that it's not true and convince myself that the obsession isn't true. Simply, this is to demonstrate that we can change the way that somebody feels about an obsession or about a trigger by writing a different story. So here is the counter story. I find a mushroom. I'm an experienced mushroom hunter and I have found the species many times before. It has all of the features of an oyster mushroom. Oyster mushrooms are recommended for beginners because there are no poisonous lookalikes. I look it over for rot and spoilage and maggots and I see none. It's in pristine condition and it smells lovely. I take the mushroom home and I cook it up for dinner. So what we're doing here is an exercise actually that we call bridging. We're starting with the trigger. We're ending with moving on with life rather than doing a compulsion. An obsessional story is going to start with the obsessional doubt. We're going to fill it in with logic and reasoning supporting the doubt, and then all of the justifications that you or your client can think of, and we're going to end that story with a compulsion. Counter story is we're starting with the trigger, we're filling it in with in-context information, and then we're ending that story with moving on. Now, if this is the story I'm telling myself, would it change the way I feel about eating this mushroom? Almost certainly. Because if this is the story I'm telling myself, I'm not going to feel anxiety. I'm not going to be consumed with worry about the consequences of what if this is true. And I'm not going to be doing compulsions. I'm going to stay with what I know, and I'm going to behave with that knowledge. In ICBT, we say that doing follows from knowing. If I know that this obsession is false, then I'm going to do what I would do in a non-OCD situation, and I'm going to cook this mushroom up and I'm going to eat it. So that's going to bring us to module 4, which is our feared possible self. Couple of really important takeaways. Feared possible self is just another obsessional doubt. This is an obsessional doubt about who we are as people. It's not a doubt about a door lock. It's not a doubt about whether we hit somebody with our car or we're going to poison somebody with a mushroom. This is a doubt about who we are as people. And this is going to determine which obsessions we are the most susceptible to. I like to say it's the algorithm of the OCD. So in the spring, because I'm a permaculture hobby farmer, I'm going to get a lot of targeted ads for boots and soil and fertilizers and Fedco seeds and Baker Creek and all kinds of really fun and interesting stuff. And I love it, by the way, I eat it up. But let's say my social media algorithm, I mean, it knows what I do for fun, and it's going to show me targeted ads. This is very much like the targeted ads, right? That the algorithm of our OCD is going to determine which individual doubts we are susceptible to. So this is an explanatory model as to why somebody could be really consumed with thoughts of contamination and not give a hoot at all about accidentally harming themselves or somebody else. Or why somebody might be consumed with thoughts of accidental harm, and this person over here could be consumed with moral scrupulosity. So for me, My feared possible self is that I'm afraid that I could be somebody who makes irreversible mistakes, responsible for keeping everybody safe. Maybe I'm going to harm somebody by mistake. I'm someone who doesn't know crystal information about herself, is completely unprepared for catastrophic event, can't handle life events, gets blindsided by things, and is prone to disaster and harm, all while being catastrophically unprepared, unequipped, and ignorant. So I like to say my feared possible self is clueless. I am afraid that I could be a clueless person. You put me in a situation where my cluelessness could cause possible harm to somebody else or myself. Naturally, what that's going to create is obsessional doubts about this situation. And so if I'm walking around thinking that I'm clueless and I'm going mushroom hunting because there is a possibility for harm here, the algorithm of my OCD is going to go, bing, here's a pop-up for this ad, and this ad is, guess what? You could poison yourself or somebody else with this mushroom. What's interesting about this is that this is another obsessional doubt. But rather than it being a doubt about something on the outside or an individual doubt about a situation, this is a doubt about who I am as a person. And here's my doubt. What if I'm actually a clueless person? And then the consequence of that would be, well, I might make a careless mistake and harm myself or somebody else. And if that's true, then I have to live with that guilt forever. So I'd better be on guard. Now, this is the algorithm of every single obsession that I've ever had throughout my entire 20-something, maybe 30-something years at this point of having OCD. So it's, for me, it's not just about mushrooms. It's also about, what if I'm wrong about my sexuality? What if a home invader gets in and I can't save anybody? What if I accidentally cause harm to my dog through my negligence, right? There's all kinds of different individual doubts that I have grappled with throughout my life, but it's always been the same core concern. And that concern is I might actually be a clueless person. Now, guess what? Just like an individual doubt, this self-doubt, this feared possible self, also didn't come out of the blue. I have reasoning behind this. We know that people can make terrible, irreversible mistakes and accidentally harm themselves or those around them. That's a fact. And then we have some rules. These can be societal rules, they can be religious rules, they can be the golden rule, they can be rules we impose on ourselves. But here's one of the rules that stuck with me is you should always be careful, conscientious, and thoughtful. You shouldn't harm other people. I've read stories and seen videos of people failing to do things properly and harming themselves or somebody else. So there's some hearsay. And here's a personal experience. I've been told plenty of times I don't pay enough attention, and there are plenty of examples of that. So here I am using my personal experience to justify the idea that I might actually be a whole cloth, totally clueless person. And let's not forget that it's possible. There's always a chance that I'm clueless. Always. And so here's the story about why I could be clueless. I might be a clueless person. People can make terrible, irreversible mistakes and accidentally harm themselves or somebody else around them. You should always be careful, conscientious, and thoughtful, because I've read plenty of stories and seen videos of people failing to do things properly and harming themselves or somebody else. And I've also been told that I don't pay enough attention. There's plenty of examples of that. And I have lots of examples of making poor choices for myself. There's always a chance that I'm clueless. So I will be vigilant anywhere where I might cause harm to myself or somebody else. So there's my story about why I might be a clueless person. Now we get to the difference between obsessional and reasonable doubt. This is module 5, also called OCD is 100% imaginary. Ooh, that's a really big claim. And it's also 100% true, and I'm going to show you why. First, obsessions lack direct evidence in the here and now. Therefore, the evidence being used is, we call this indirect. This is indirect evidence. Meaning obsessional doubts are imagined, right? If there is no sensory evidence that an obsessional doubt is actually happening, an obsessional doubt is actually true in the here and now, then the quote unquote evidence is going to be internally generated. We're going to reason our way into why it could be true rather than paying attention to why it's not true. All obsessional doubts are constructed 100% in the imagination. It's a really big claim, I know. So let's get back to our normal reasoning. Normal reasoning creates reasonable doubts. We've got possibility, which is around us all the time. We also have trust in our senses and ourself, and we use relevant associations to come to a reality-based conclusion with direct evidence from our senses. That means there's direct evidence in the here and now. Contrast to that, we have obsessional doubts. We have this obsessional reasoning where we're going to over-rely on possibility. We're going to have distrust of the senses in the self, and we're going to use irrelevant associations. The result of using this reasoning process is a confusion between reality and possibility. There's no direct evidence in the here and now. So to recall, here's my obsessional doubt story. I might have misidentified this mushroom. Mushrooms can have multiple poisonous lookalikes, and species can be very easy to confuse. Misidentification can have deadly consequences. I know that even experts misidentify mushrooms. Mushroom poisonings are very unpleasant and sometimes fatal. Even I have misidentified things while foraging, so it's possible this just looks like an oyster mushroom, but it's actually very poisonous. I should check again to make sure this is the species that I think it is. Where is the direct evidence? What did my eyes tell me? What did my common sense tell me? I knew what this mushroom was, and I doubted what I knew, and instead I fabricated a story that it might not actually be what I thought it was. So this story that I have come up with is 100% imaginary because there is no direct evidence to tell me this is not the mushroom that I think it is. As a matter of fact, I have all the direct evidence that I need in order to extrapolate a reality-based conclusion. I take that information and I put it aside, and instead I choose to pay attention to this imaginary hypothetical that I have come up with. So we've broken it down here so that we can see where this obsessional reasoning is. It's pretty cool. So blue text is over-reliance on possibility. I've used purple to highlight irrelevant associations, and yellow is me distrusting my senses and myself. So this is a fun visual way to illustrate that somebody is using obsessional reasoning. Here's my reasoning. Notice what's missing. Direct evidence. Absolutely no direct evidence in the here and now. Where is the direct evidence that this isn't the mushroom that I think it is? There isn't any. There is a complete lack of direct evidence in this story. So the information that I'm using is being used out of context to justify something that isn't really there. It's being used to justify something that I have created in my imagination. Now we can take this obsessional doubt and we can make this reasonable by adding direct evidence. I might have misidentified this mushroom. It looks like an oyster mushroom, but it's the wrong color, and I found it on the wrong host species. And it's fall. When we know that mushrooms can have multiple poisonous lookalikes and species can be very easy to confuse, misidentification can have deadly consequences, I know that even experts misidentify mushrooms. Mushroom poisonings are very unpleasant and sometimes fatal. Even I have misidentified things while foraging, so it's possible that this just looks like an oyster mushroom, but it's actually very poisonous. I should check again to make sure the species is what I think it is. So we added a couple sentences here to take this from obsessional to reasonable. And by reasonable, I mean, I actually have reason to worry about this in the here and now. And I added direct evidence. I added sense information. It looks like an oyster mushroom, but there's something wrong about it. It's the wrong color. And I also found it on the wrong host species and in the wrong season. Now it's reasonable. So here's a poisonous mushroom, the jack-o'-lantern. Very interesting. It's bioluminescent. It means it glows in the dark, but it's toxic. Looks kind of cool, looks kind of nice to eat, doesn't it? This one won't kill you, but you're going to have terrible abdominal cramps and diarrhea for a couple hours. This one is actually picked by accident because it looks very similar to another edible called a chanterelle, but it doesn't share seasonality with a spring mushroom, and they grow in different host species. It also glows in the dark, which an oyster definitely does not. So I change a few details, we get a reasonable doubt. Now I have something to worry about. Now I have direct evidence. Without that direct evidence, my obsession is 100% imaginary. Now, here's another really big claim that I-CBT makes that some people can't stomach and some people kind of raise an eyebrow at. And here it is. Possibility doesn't matter. Your obsessional doubt is 100% irrelevant to a reality. If obsessions are constructed in the imagination, we don't have to listen to possibility. Possibility only matters with direct evidence. And possibility by itself is not a valid ingredient in the here and now. So just because it's true that there are poisonous mushrooms out there, that there are poisonous mushrooms that are so difficult to identify that even experts go, you know what, I'm not even going to bother. Just because that is an objective fact doesn't make it relevant. Yes, it's true that there are poisonous mushrooms, and it's important for foragers to be able to identify not just the edible ones, but the toxic ones. But just because that's true doesn't make it relevant to this moment. Likewise, just because something is possible in the abstract doesn't make that relevant either. Now, one of the ways that we can illustrate over-reliance on possibility is highlighting how selective it is. Here's a few things that I'm not worried about, even though they are also possible in the abstract. This mushroom could be colonized by something invisible and deadly. Possible. There could be a rattlesnake hiding in the brush as I collect mushrooms. Possible. I could get hit by a car on the way back. Possible. It's possible that in the future we're going to find out that mushrooms could be carcinogenic. Totally possible. I could get arrested for trespassing. Possible. Why don't I worry about those things? Because I'm using possibility selectively. As a matter of fact, in most places in my life, I don't rely on the possibility of something bad happening alone. Imagine if I was running around treating all possibilities as relevant. I would never get anything done. I would practically be catatonic. It also doesn't matter whether one obsession is more probable than another. It's more probable that I'll step on a rattlesnake than eating a mushroom that's colonized by a secret deadly bacteria. That still doesn't make it relevant. What makes possibility relevant is direct evidence in the here and now. And there is no direct evidence in the here and now. So therefore, the possibility of something bad happening is not relevant. Now, this one is one of my personal favorites. We call this the OCD bubble. A couple really important teaching points for us up top. People with OCD are going to reason their way into unreality. It's a reasoning process that draws us out of our objective reality and into our imagination. This is going to create more doubt. It's going to create less security. To somebody with OCD, it's going to feel like it's doing the opposite. It's going to feel like we're solving a doubt, and it's going to feel like we're making ourselves more secure around this thing. It's actually doing the opposite. What is the most interesting piece about this is that there is an exact moment in time that we can pinpoint, we can point to and say, this is the moment where somebody has left their reality and is going into the imagination. And I'll teach you how to do that here in just a second. Now, when somebody with OCD isn't triggered, they're going to be using mostly their perception, but their imagination can be used as well, and those two things are going to share space. That's why we can stand in the mirror and imagine what we might look like with a new haircut, or visualize our office with new furniture or new paint, or imagine how nice it would be to travel. Imagination is not a bad thing. Now, when somebody's OCD is triggered, they're going to rely a lot more on the imagination and use that obsessional reasoning process. They're going to distrust their perception, over-rely on possibility, and they're going to use irrelevant associations to justify an obsession. Notice that this imagination is going to get superimposed over our perception, and we're going to give a lot of undue weight to the imagination rather than paying attention to what our perception is telling us. So when I'm using that reasoning process, a harmless and delicious edible mushroom is going to look like a terrible poisonous mushroom. This is where we see that imagination superimposed over our reality. Now, if we remember this from Module 1, the obsessional reasoning process is going to form a doubt when I encounter a trigger. And that trigger for me is I'm going to see a mushroom and I'm going to pick it. And this reasoning process is super fast. It's like right there. So fast, which is why in ICBT it's very important that we're going to slow everything down so we can demystify this process. So this reasoning process is going to get set off by a trigger, and that reasoning process is going to create a doubt. That doubt is, what if I've misidentified this mushroom? And then I'm going to go down the rabbit hole and start telling myself like, oh, and the consequence would be this. I'm going to feel super anxious, and then I'm going to do a compulsion. Now, right after I ask that what if question is what we call the crossover point. Right after I say to myself, what if I misidentified this mushroom? And then the sequence continues. I'm going to imagine the consequences. I'm going to feel a bunch of anxiety because, oh my God, I would never want to be responsible for that. And I do a compulsion. If I can disengage from this sequence, if I can drop it right after I ask that what if question, then the rest of this sequence isn't going to occur. What's really important to notice and to really get a grasp of is that going into the OCD bubble is actually a dissociative experience, not a capital D dissociation where we are forgetting who we are or where we are or forgetting our history. I like to call it a lowercase d dissociation, where that imagination is getting superimposed over our reality, and we start getting lost in that imagination. We start getting absorbed in that imagination. We're dissociated. And it happens right after we ask that what if question. Now, when I'm in that dissociative state, when I'm absorbed into my imagination, I'm losing contact with my sensory reality, giving so much weight to my imagination that my sensory reality almost seems to not matter as much anymore. What that's going to do is that's going to create more anxiety for me, not less. It's going to create more insecurity for me, not less, because I'm not paying attention to what's going on around me. And it's going to create more doubt. The more that I engage in this sequence, the stronger that doubt is going to be next time. The more I'm going to undermine my ability to trust myself. So what we can do when we notice that we have left our reality is we can imagine that we're standing on a bridge. And on one side of that bridge is imagination, and on the other side is reality. And at this point, when we notice and we believe that our OCD is 100% imaginary, when we understand why possibility is completely irrelevant, what we do is we give ourselves the choice to come back to reality rather than going farther into the imagination. Sometimes we might still slip up. We might still choose to go and follow that obsessional reasoning and go into the OCD bubble and do a bunch of compulsions, which, by the way, are only going to work to reinforce the disorder. And you're not going to win a ticket out of the OCD bubble permanently. What we're looking to do is have somebody come back to reality, to drop the story, to choose to no longer chase this rabbit down the rabbit hole and go into the OCD bubble and do a bunch of compulsions, but rather come back to reality where their senses matter and where their common sense matters, rather than going further and further into the imagination to try and solve a problem that was not there to begin with. So next we get to the real story. We know that stories change the way that we feel. If we can change the story, we can change the way that we view the trigger. So we've seen this story a couple of times. I'm not going to run through it, but here's my obsessional story. And we're going to do things a little bit differently with the alternative. We want to start with the trigger. We're going to include senses that I trust. And I'm also going to include how I trust those senses in other situations. And I'm going to end this story with moving on with life rather than doing compulsions. So here's what my alternative story is going to look like. Now, we're going to take obsessional reasoning out of this. And rather than relying on obsessional reasoning, I'm going to rely on what my senses are telling me, and I'm going to trust what they tell me. So we're going to start with the trigger. And the trigger is that I encounter what looks like an oyster mushroom. I know it's an oyster mushroom because of the way it looks, where it's growing, its host species, the way it smells, and the season I found it in. I have found and eaten many mushroom species before, and I've even found this one many times. It's one of my favorites. I can trust myself with picking this mushroom the same way that I trust myself while I'm driving, picking a career, and working with clients. I take it home and I cook it for myself and my family. Now, if I told myself this story, imagine how I would feel. Pretty good, right? And now there's another version that we could write about this where we zoom out even farther, where the trigger just becomes part of life. The doubt doesn't even occur to us. We're going to start this story before I even encounter a trigger. We're driving down the road from our old house to our new house. and I see an oyster mushroom on the roadside. I'm so excited. I love mushroom hunting, and it's especially fun as the passenger of a car. It's like treasure hunting. I talk my husband into grabbing it for me because I'm not tall enough and I can't reach. He goes and grabs it for me, and I can tell right away I was 100% correct in identifying it, even from 40 feet away, and I'm thrilled with my skill level. I take it home and I cook it for myself and my family. Now, notice how much different I might feel if this is the story that I'm telling myself. This is a story that is completely devoid of obsessional reasoning. I am not trying to convince myself of anything. I'm simply sticking with what I know. I'm simply trusting what's in front of me. So this is what it looks like to encounter a trigger when you don't have OCD. Right? It just becomes part of the story. It just becomes part of the background. This thing that used to freak me out and used to scare me, and I used to tell myself this big story about, I'm going to poison somebody. It's going to be all my fault. It's going to be the worst thing ever. They're going to die. This doesn't even occur because instead of going with my obsessional reasoning, I'm staying with what I know. And here's what I know. This is an oyster mushroom. And I'm not going to poison somebody that I love with an oyster mushroom. Now let's also talk about tricks and cheats of the OCD. Now, if you're working with clients, you can totally bring this in a little bit earlier than reserving it for Module 10. I think it's a really valuable use of psychoeducation to use up front. But I reserved it and I put it here in Module 10 because I wanted this to appeal to some beginner clinicians and to clients who have never worked with ICBT before. But we're going to talk about tricks and cheats. So we know that OCD is a magician and it swaps out reality for imagination. And it does this unwittingly, right? It does this without us noticing, which is why in ICBT, I'm constantly going to be encouraging you, go slow it down. Don't rush through this, right? We want to see the where and when the magician swaps out imagination for reality, or rather swaps out reality for our imagination. Now, OCD is going to use a menagerie of different tricks to confuse us. And we can notice these tricks and no longer get fooled by them. Now, if we think of OCD as a magician, and let's say we have a magician's trick, and he has one thing that he's going to swap out for another thing, and he's going to make it look like it's magic. And if he goes step by step and shows you exactly what this looks like, and shows you where he swapped out this thing, swapped out one card for another, let's say, shows you step by step, here's where and when I did it, here's how I distracted you. Then if he shows you that trick again, you're going to see that. You're going to see the exact moment that he did that. And you're no longer going to get bamboozled by it. You're no longer going to think magic is real. It's exactly the same when we're doing ICBT. We're going to show you how your OCD is doing that to you. We're going to show you how the OCD, instead of swapping out two cards, is going to swap out a reality for imagination and make you think that your imagination is reality. And so we're going to slow it down and we're going to take a look at this process. And part of this process is the reasoning process and the tricks and cheats that OCD uses to get us to pay attention to that. So I'm not going to include all of the tricks because these are just the tricks that I was the most susceptible to when I'm engaging in this obsession. First up, we have reverse reasoning. You're going to start with a fact and then come to a conclusion. Mushrooms can be poisonous, so then this one could be poisonous. Notice that I'm not checking in with my senses. I'm simply going with an imagined hypothetical. So I'm going to grab a fact and I'm going to extrapolate a conclusion from that. In normal reasoning, we are going to make an observation and then come to a conclusion. Instead, I'm going to take some abstract fact and I'm going to come to a conclusion about that. Mushrooms can be poisonous, so therefore this one could be poisonous. When we're living the fear, the OCD story is so convincing that we start to experience it as if there really is something happening in the here and now. I can imagine what it would be like to accidentally poison my family so vividly that it starts to feel real. What's interesting, though, is that that feeling real sensation is going to come after I start to doubt and worry, not before. And just let me assure you, and if you're a therapist, assure your clients that, yeah, of course it feels real. OCD feels real. It's part of it, right? It creates this lived-in experience. That doesn't make it real. Just because it feels real doesn't make it real, right? Nightmares can feel real. Getting lost in a super fun video game, that can feel real. All kinds of things can feel real. That doesn't make it real. Now, with dismissal of actual evidence, we've got distrust of the senses and we've got going deep. And distrust of the senses is exactly what it says on the tin. We don't trust ourselves and we don't trust our senses. I can see this as an oyster mushroom, but I might be wrong, right? So notice that word, but, very important. I see this as an oyster mushroom, but I think I might be wrong, right? So we have the information that we need right in front of us. I can see it's an oyster mushroom, and we have this magic word, and we go, but that's how we know that somebody's distrusting their senses or themselves. Now, going deep involves us having all the information that we need and thinking, well, if I just had a little bit more information, I could solve this for good. So what's really interesting here is this going deep trick is going to make somebody with OCD feel like they're coming closer to reality. They're actually going farther away from reality. But to them, it's going to feel the opposite. If they just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper, then we could solve this problem forever. But what's actually happening is they're not coming any closer in contact to their sensory reality. They're going farther into their imagination. To them, it feels like they're doing the opposite. So I might go, okay, well, this looks like an oyster mushroom, but I can't be sure unless I check and I think about it and I keep going and I keep looking at this from all different angles. Now let's discuss it as when somebody is going to sit with the doubt and they're going to try to consider it from all angles. Well, maybe I haven't considered this enough. Well, let me keep thinking. Maybe I didn't check it enough. Maybe there's some other secret, mushroom out there that I don't even know what it is. And it looks exactly like an oyster mushroom, but isn't, right? So I'm going to keep running through these scenarios in my head and trying to really, really, really figure it out. And then we have maybe this time and maybe later. Now, OCD knows obsessional doubts haven't come true in the past. And then it goes, yeah, but maybe this time. I haven't been wrong with identifying mushrooms before, but maybe this time is the time where I accidentally poisoned my family. Or it predicts a consequence in the future. Because we know that in mushroom poisoning cases, it takes a couple hours sometimes for onset. So maybe 5 hours after eating it, I'll get sick, right? Where it's predicting this thing that happens in the future. And then we have irrelevant associations. We have some facts and a context. These are facts that are objectively true that the OCD uses to justify an obsession. We call this a fact out of context because there is no direct evidence. That's why we say this fact is taken out of context. So while mushrooms can be poisonous is a true fact on paper, it's like taking a page out of a book and trying to put it in a different book. Yes, that page is real. Yes, I ripped it from this other book, but it doesn't belong in this story. Similarly, mismatching are things that have happened to other people. This is things that have happened to ourselves or elsewhere, and they're applied arbitrarily to our current situation. Like saying, well, I misidentified a plant species last week and it tasted disgusting, or this happened to somebody else, therefore it could happen to me. And then we come to real self. This is who we actually are, not who the OCD says we are. It's actually the opposite of the OCD self. So my OCD self, my feared possible self is, oh, I'm clueless, right? I'm going to make a terrible mistake and it's going to be the worst thing ever and it's going to be so horrible. And I'm afraid that I'm somebody who could make irreversible mistakes. I'm responsible for keeping everyone safe. I might harm myself. I might harm somebody by mistake. I'm not going to know crucial information about myself. I'm going to be totally unprepared. I'm going to get blindsided by things, prone to disaster and harm, all while being catastrophically unprepared. Right? My OCD self is clueless. Now, that is the polar opposite of who I actually am. If I look at the data, overwhelmingly, I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm capable of. I have over and over again proven that I'm smart, that I'm capable, that not only am I informed and knowledgeable, I'm also wise, right? I know how to apply this knowledge to situations. That if I take a look demonstrably how I show up every day in my life, I'm not clueless at all. My real self is actually quite competent. I'm formally educated. I'm always seeking knowledge in my career and in my areas of interest. I take pride in my job and I enjoy my hobbies deeply. I have a good, stable marriage and healthy family relationships. My friends say I'm funny and caring. My clients tell me they feel supported and listened to by me. I'm brave and daring. I love mushroom hunting, and I even added 5 new species to my found list this year. Right? Is that the snapshot of a clueless person? No, because I'm not clueless. And that's not to say that I am not capable of cluelessness. Yes, of course, sometimes I'm going to make a mistake. That's being human. That's not an identity. A mistake is not an identity. Being clueless is not an identity. That is a false self that is created and is just as imaginary as an individual doubt, right? That's just as imaginary as standing at the door and knowing that your door is locked and then going, well, what if it's not? Right? So I have all the information that I need to tell me that I'm actually not a clueless person. And then my OCD will go, well, but what if you are, right? What if you actually are clueless? But if we consider the information in context, the direct evidence that's right in front of me, my real self is that I am actually a really competent person. And so when you're doing module 11 on your own and with somebody else, you're actually going to be having your client or yourself be writing an autobiography and keeping note of who you actually are. Because who you are is the complete opposite of who the OCD says you're going to be. And if we can get somebody to a place where they don't have to listen to that anymore, imagine how much space that frees up for them. Imagine how much peace gets introduced into your life, knowing that they don't have to live in the shadow of who they're afraid that they could become. Let me tell you that it is an it's a gift, right? It's ineffable. It's almost spiritual to be able to see the scales fall from my eyes and go, I'm actually not that person. And I'm here to tell you from the other side of the fence that neither are you. Neither are your clients. Your clients are so invested in keeping this feared possible self from coming true. They don't have to, because it's not who they actually are. And lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about reality sensing, where we're going to put it all together. We're going to use our senses in OCD situations the same way we do in non-OCD situations, which is pretty interesting to notice that for you or for your clients, that most of the time when your OCD is not triggered, you're using your senses non-compulsively. You're just trusting what they tell you. So we're going to start to notice and start putting this together that when your OCD is not triggered, let's say when you're driving, let's say you have no obsessions about driving whatsoever. You see that the light is red, so you stop. What made you do that? Your senses, right? Your common sense. You're trusting those things. You're staying with those things. When you're standing behind somebody in line at the grocery store and the little old lady in front of you is taking way too long to counter change, you're trusting that you don't want to hurt her. Right? So this includes the senses that we trust. It's not just our five senses. It's not just about the senses that we learn in kindergarten, about your hearing and your sense of taste and your sense of smell, but also trusting who you are as a person. So staying with my senses involves noticing and accepting what they're telling me. I can see this as an oyster mushroom. I know that there's no in-season poisonous lookalikes. I know oysters are one of the easiest to identify. I've been doing this for almost 10 years. I know that I'm not clueless enough to accidentally poison my family. This is the gift that ICBT gives us, is that when we know, we can do, right? That doing always follows from knowing. I know that I'm not a clueless person. I know that my senses are trustworthy. I trust them all over. There's no problem with my perception. There's no problem with our senses. Our senses work. They work in every non-OCD situation that we encounter. The problem is we distrust those things. We need to get back to trusting those things, right? We need to get back to trusting our reality, because our reality has all the information that we need. So rather than going into the imagination, we learn to stay with reality and with what those senses are telling us. And that's exactly what I did. Here's the actual oyster mushroom that I picked. Right? It was a couple of pounds. Look at that thing. It's pristine. There's not a bug on there. It's perfect. Perfect. Awesome. So part of it I cut up and I put it in a soup, and the other part I cut up and I dehydrated it and I reserved it for my mom, and I gave it to her in a little jar with a label on it, and I said, here you go, because I trust that I'm not clueless enough to poison my family. I trust what my senses are telling me. I trust that I'm competent enough to not live in the shadow of what OCD says might happen. And let me tell you from personal experience, that is a beautiful way to live. That this is the greatest gift that ICBT has given me. And I hope that it's a gift that you can give yourself and that you can give to your clients if you're working with clients, is this beautiful, unbelievable gift of being able to trust yourself effortlessly, the way that people without OCD do all the time. They're not going to bed going, maybe I'm going to poison my family, maybe I'm not, maybe I'm harmful, maybe I'm not. Nobody's doing that. We're simply staying with what we know, right? We're simply staying with the certainty that we're actually not who OCD says that we are, that our senses work, that we don't have to rely on our imagination, that we don't have to reason our way into an obsession, that we can drop it because we know it's 100% imaginary and possibility doesn't matter. It's a beautiful gift, and it is my, we'll say, divine purpose to give that gift to as many people as possible. So I thank you very much for sharing your time with me today, and I hope that this was helpful for you. Take care.